continuation. Yeah.
Today's Washington Post has a big story on how, now that North Korea is so heavily in the news, all three of the countries that were named in Bush's infamous Axis of Evil State of the Union address are fully in play, as we've now got Iraq, Iran, and North Korea being huge focuses of foreign policy.
Any particular significance to this in your view?
My significance is that, as the point I was just finishing on, Bush's authority and Blair's authority are hugely undermined by the way we went into war in Iraq. And that's my problem with neoconservatism and the way they took us into war, because it's very difficult now to envisage a situation where either Bush or Blair had the authority on the international stage to take tough action against either Iran or North Korea, should it be necessary. They've weakened their case, and sort of perhaps, as the Washington Post is suggesting, also certainly some of the people who've commented in it, we went after the wrong one of the three. After the State of the
Oliver, what do you think of this story?
2 points. I think that there are many criticisms you can make of the original Axis of Evil conceit. There is no question but that the three regimes President Bush referred to are all evil, one of them now toppled, but in no sense were they a homogeneous movement, and to present them as a common threat, they're all threatening, but to present them as a common threat to be dealt with by similar means, I think was a mistake and diverted attention to a large degree on what could be done practically about all of them. I do not agree that by toppling Saddam Hussein, we thereby hobbled ourselves from taking necessary action against the other regimes identified. I mean, why didn't we go after North Korea, for example? Two principal reasons. First, it is a grotesque, monstrous tyranny, but it isn't one that is exporting terror in the sense that Saddam Hussein was exporting terror. It certainly is a terrorist-sponsoring country, but it is an autarkic movement rather than an expansionist one. And secondly, more to the point, it had got beyond the stage where we could take action of the type that we took against Saddam Hussein. One of the reasons, I remain one of the few people who believes that one of the principal reasons that we ought to have toppled Saddam Hussein was WMD, not because he had them, but because he didn't, and wished to get them in a usable form. Had we waited for him to get that capability, and had we waited for him to use his dual production facilities to produce chemical and biological weapons, then we would have had a much more difficult job in dealing with a regional tyrant who was becoming an extremely difficult threat to deal with.
Okay, Oliver, leading on, what have you got for us?
The story I identified was in this week's issue of Der Spiegel. Der Spiegel is the German equivalent in content largely and certainly format of Newsweek or Time. It is a very fine magazine giving a German view of world affairs. It does have an English language version on its website. It reports this week on a disturbing story in German politics, which is the rise of the far right. It has a vignette of quite a poor, or rather very unequal area of Germany in the far northeastern corner, the Baltic holiday resorts, that will be familiar to readers of the Riddle of the Sands. In this ostensibly very affluent area, the far-right NPD in regional elections 3 weeks ago got 10% of the vote. This is obviously of great concern to Germany, to my mind, a triumph of democracy, having been clearly a regime of total barbarism, to have built upon it a conservatism that was shorn of xenophobia and a social democracy that recognised.
Seeing a resurgence of that.
We're now seeing a resurgence of xenophobia, yeah. And there is a commitment on both sides of the political spectrum in Germany to fashion or to reassert the values of a so-called militant democracy against it.
Douglas, any thoughts?
Well, I agree. I think that it's always a concern when there's a sort of re-eruption of this kind of sentiment in Europe. I suspect strongly in Germany, as in France in recent years, that the popular opinion and opinion from all major political parties will see this off. I mean, it's never good to be sanguine about the threat from the far right in Europe, but I don't see it as being the threat that some people do at the moment. I think it's been seen off significantly enough, and I think that at the moment there are enough people who are willing to see it off.
Even though the far-right party in Austria just got 11% of the vote.
Well, yeah, Austria's not a
special
happy
case, shall we say.
example.
It's a special case. Well,
yeah.
let's lead on into your story, because I think you've got something...
Oh yeah, I thought one of the interesting stories of the week was a story that made it into one of the British papers, but got very heavily covered in the blogosphere, which was the news of continuing riotings, not really the news, of riotings in the north of Paris. With 14,
I didn't hear a word of that.
14 police officers each day being injured. Police officers in Paris are now demanding that they have armoured vehicles to go into some of these suburbs. Of course, this really demonstrates to my mind, the reason why it's an important story, I think, is it demonstrates that much of the activity of our time isn't just erupting in single bursts. It's ongoing narratives, to use that dreadful word of the left. And the narrative of France really is a state and a government which is slowly losing control of significant parts of its country. The Islamic suburbs of Paris demonstrate this. It wasn't just something from last fall in Paris. It wasn't a one-off. This has been going on for many years now. And I think demonstrates that the French government is losing control of its own territory.
Stephen, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's silly there, but the fact that the French government can't control these parts of the country has a lot to do with the fact that it, for so long, neglected them and sort of didn't realise they were there. I mean, there's when La Haine, the Matthew Kassovitz film, came out about the situation in the banlieue and the suburbs of Paris, and the French cabinet sat and watched a special screening of it because they didn't believe. They believed the case was overstated, and I think, unfortunately, in some of the riots that we've been seeing over not just the recent ones, but over the past year, that there's still a lot to be done. The French government have to break down the barriers that there are between the suburbs and the rest of the French people in city centres and rural areas.
With increased multiculturalism, or...?
Well, I think the problem is in France is the ghettoisation. It's the way they're concentrated, particularly in the banlieue, and then ignored by the government, and it's there's no meshing of the cultures.
Okay, gentlemen, thanks. We must move on now to our global risk assessment, the section of the show where I throw the spotlight on areas of the world which has seen an increase or decrease in global risk over the past week. Unsurprisingly, one country dominates the assessment this week, North Korea. In case you've been hibernating in a nuclear bunker, yesterday, the world's most secretive and repressive regime announced that it had conducted its first underground nuclear test. The world was predictably horrified, and the action has now moved from Pyongyang to New York, where the UN bureaucracy has been limbering up today to prepare a response. Much will, of course, depend on the attitude of China, one of North Korea's few allies, but whose influence could not apparently prevent the dear leader, Kim Jong-il, from conducting the test. So far, the Chinese have called for appropriate action from the UN, but have made it clear that military action against the regime would be unimaginable. The US and Britain, on the other hand, are pressing for tough sanctions on North Korea to be conducted under the UN's Chapter 7, making them mandatory and enforceable by military means. Now, Worldview's assessment is clear. The UN must now show that it can act to prevent rogue nations from doing as they please. A failure to adopt mandatory and enforceable sanctions will not only highlight the UN's impotence yet again and allow this madman to develop his capabilities, but will also give encouragement to other dangerous regimes such as Iran to do likewise. A fair assessment, Douglas?
Well, I mean, you referred to the UN limbering up. I mean, I sort of see it as sort of staggering or perhaps festering up. I don't see the UN doing anything. It's so late in the day for the UN. It's just incredible and really demonstrates one of the appalling things about that organization. That, I mean, a country, a rogue state like North Korea, sets off a nuclear test successfully, and the UN meets in an emergency session to talk about possible sanctions. I mean, this is pathetic. quite
So,
frankly.
typical UN impotence? Oliver?
No, I don't agree. I think there are grounds for being certainly deeply concerned about the North Korean test, but to be more hopeful
long
about
enough.
the UN response. I would certainly share Douglas's view that the UN was hopeless in dealing with Iraq after the ceasefire agreement that concluded the first Gulf War. The main culprits in that were self-interested nations, specifically France and Russia, that stymied effective action. In the case of North Korea, nobody has an interest in defending it. What must happen now, because there is no serious prospect of a military strike, the risks are literally incalculable. What must happen is that the United States uses its influence with China